The morning of February 9, 1944, 20,000 feet above Oschersleben, Germany, Lieutenant Jack Ilfrey pulls his P-38 Lightning into a shallow dive, lining up behind a formation of Messerschmitt 109s. The twin Allison engines hum their characteristic muffled roar as he closes the distance. At 400 yards, the lead German pilot glances back, sees the distinctive twin-boom silhouette, and does exactly what Luftwaffe tactical doctrine prescribes. He rolls inverted, pulls through into a split-S maneuver, and dives vertically toward the frozen German countryside 7 miles below. Ilfrey's hands move to follow, but every instinct screams at him to stop. At this altitude, in this aircraft, pursuing that dive means gambling with physics itself. The German pilot knows something that American Lightning pilots have learned through bitter experience. The P-38 has a secret weakness, a fundamental flaw that transforms its greatest tactical advantage into a death sentence. Above 350 miles per hour in a dive, the Lightning doesn't just lose performance, it tries to kill its pilot. By early 1944, Luftwaffe intelligence had documented this weakness with scientific precision. German fighter pilots across the European theatre received explicit instructions. When engaged by P-38 seconds at high altitude, initiate a split-S and dive. The Lightning cannot follow. Its pilots call it compressibility. Engineers call it transonic shockwave formation. German pilots call it their guaranteed escape route. But in the vastness of the Pacific theatre, American pilots were learning something different. They were learning that the split-S maneuver, when executed by the Lightning itself, could transform this troubled fighter into something approaching perfection. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The tropical humidity of Port Moresby pressed against Captain Thomas Maguire's flight suit as he climbed into his P-38 on the morning of August 18, 1943. At 23, the New Jersey native had been flying combat missions over New Guinea for 6 months, accumulating victories through a tactical approach that seemed to contradict everything the Army Air Force taught about fighter combat. While other pilots tried to dogfight with Japanese Zeros at low altitude, trading on maneuverability and turning radius, Maguire had developed a different philosophy. Altitude equals life. Speed equals survival. The split-S maneuver equals victory. The morning's intelligence briefing had been straightforward. Japanese fighters were staging through WWII airfield, preparing to escort bomber formations against Allied positions. Maguire would lead a flight of 4 P-38 seconds on a fighter sweep, climbing to 25,000 feet before the enemy even knew they were airborne. The mission profile was simple in concept but demanding in execution. Loiter at high altitude. Wait for enemy formations to appear below. Dive on them with concentrated firepower. Use the split-S to reverse direction and zoom back to altitude before the survivors could respond. It was a tactical approach, built entirely around the P-38's specific characteristics. The Lightning couldn't turn with a Zero. At low altitude, in a sustained circular fight, the Japanese fighter's superior maneuverability would win every time. But the P-38 was faster. It climbed better. Its twin engines produced 3,200 horsepower combined, giving it energy management capabilities no single-engine fighter could match. Most importantly, its 450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon were mounted in the nose, firing directly forward with no convergence issues. When a Lightning pilot aimed at a target, every round went exactly where the gun sight pointed. Maguire's P-38, painted in the olive drab and neutral grey standard for Pacific theatre operations, showed the weathering of 6 months of tropical service. Salt air had corroded some of the aluminum skin panels. Hydraulic fluid stained the landing gear wells. The plexiglass canopy carried scratches from countless takeoffs through dust and coral fragments. But the Allison engines started with their characteristic smooth rumble, oil pressure climbing steadily into the green arc. Manifold pressure held steady. Turbo superchargers spooled up normally. The aircraft was mechanically sound, despite its worn appearance. The takeoff from Port Moresby's steel matting runway required careful technique. The P-38's tricycle landing gear made ground handling easier than conventional tail draggers, but the twin engines demanded constant attention to throttle coordination. Too much power on one engine would swing the aircraft off the runway centerline. The counter-rotating propellers reduced torque effects, but pilots still needed to maintain balanced power throughout the takeoff roll. Maguire's hands moved automatically across the cockpit, adjusting mixture, propeller pitch, and turbo supercharger settings as the Lightning accelerated down the runway. At 110 miles per hour indicated, the nose wheel lifted. At 120, the mains left the steel matting. Maguire raised the landing gear and began his climb to altitude, the twin booms and tail surfaces creating their distinctive silhouette against the morning sky. The cockpit was spacious compared to single-engine fighters, the greenhouse canopy providing excellent visibility, except where the engine nacelles created blind spots to the rear quarter. The instrument panel held the standard array of flight instruments, engine gauges, and weapons controls that every P-38 pilot memorized through hundreds of hours of training. The climb to 25,000 feet took 18 minutes, the turbo superchargers maintaining manifold pressure as the air thinned. Other P-38 pilots had complained about cockpit heating problems in European operations, where temperatures at altitude reached 40 degrees below zero. But here in the tropics, the lack of adequate heating was barely noticeable. The Pacific theater had proven ideal for Lightning operations. No sub-zero temperatures, no icing conditions that plagued European squadrons. The twin Allison engines ran reliably in the humid tropical air, and the aircraft's range allowed missions that would be impossible for single-engine types. At altitude, Maguire leveled off and established his combat air patrol pattern. The other three P-38 seconds in his flight maintained loose formation, each aircraft separated by 1,000 feet to allow freedom of maneuver when combat began. They flew in what Pacific theater pilots called Finger 4 formation, named for the spacing of 4 fingers on an outstretched hand. Element leaders and wingmen could exchange positions freely as the tactical situation demanded, unlike the rigid formations required in European operations. 20 minutes into the patrol, Maguire's wingman called out enemy aircraft. 9 o'clock low, 15,000 feet below, a formation of Japanese fighters heading toward Allied positions. The distinctive radial engine cowlings and greenhouse canopies identified them as Zeros. Maguire counted 8 aircraft in 2 4-ship divisions. The Japanese pilots flew the precise, disciplined formations that came from years of training. Most had been fighting since the invasion of China in 1937. They knew their business, but they were 10,000 feet below, unaware of the 4 P-38 seconds positioned perfectly for an attack. Maguire's pulse remained steady as he calculated the intercept geometry. The split S maneuver would bring him down on the enemy formation from their blind spot above and behind. The dive would accelerate his Lightning to over 400 miles per hour, too fast for the Zeros to evade. The concentrated nose-mounted armament would allow him to open fire at ranges where wing-mounted guns would still be converging. If executed correctly, he would destroy at least one enemy aircraft before the survivors even realized they were under attack. Maguire rolled his P-38 inverted, checked that his wingman was positioned correctly, and pulled through into the split S. The twin-boom fighter pivoted smoothly through the first half of the maneuver, the nose dropping toward the earth as gravity accelerated the dive. Airspeed built rapidly. 250 miles per hour. 300. 350. The Japanese formation grew larger in his gun sight as the range closed. At 600 yards, Maguire selected a Zero on the left side of the enemy formation and centered his gun sight pipper on its fuselage. The gunnery principles were straightforward. The Zero was flying straight and level, unaware of the threat. No deflection shooting required. Simply center the target in the sight and fire when range decreased to optimum killing distance. At 400 yards, close enough that the 20mm cannon rounds would have sufficient kinetic energy to penetrate, but far enough that debris from a destroyed target wouldn't threaten the attacking P-38. Maguire pressed the trigger. 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon erupted simultaneously. The P-38 shuddered slightly from the recoil, but the concentrated firepower created a cone of destruction that crossed 400 yards in less than half a second. The Zero absorbed the hits along its fuselage and left wing route, Pieces of aluminum skin and internal structure fragments separated from the aircraft. The fuel tank behind the engine exploded, transforming the fighter into a fireball that tumbled out of formation. Maguire's wingman had fired at almost the same instant, destroying a second Zero before the surviving Japanese pilots could react. The remaining 6 enemy fighters scattered, rolling hard into defensive breaks as they searched frantically for their attackers. But by then, Maguire was already executing the second half of his tactical plan. He pulled back on the control column, converting his dive speed into a climbing zoom that carried his P-38 back toward altitude. The twin Allison engines, still producing maximum power, pulled the Lightning upward at a rate no single-engine fighter could match. 30 seconds after initiating the attack, Maguire was back at 20,000 feet, reforming his flight and assessing the tactical situation. 2 Japanese fighters destroyed, 6 survivors scattered and defensive. His P-38 seconds had suffered no damage, expended less than 200 rounds of ammunition per aircraft, and maintained complete tactical control of the engagement. The split S maneuver, combined with the altitude advantage and concentrated firepower of the Lightning, had transformed what could have been a dangerous dogfight into a one-sided execution. This was the tactical revelation that Pacific Theater P-38 pilots discovered through combat experience. The split S maneuver, properly executed from a position of altitude advantage, turned the Lightning into a devastating weapon. But the same maneuver, when forced by enemy action at the wrong altitude or airspeed, could trigger the compressibility problems that made the aircraft nearly uncontrollable. The difference between victory and death came down to understanding exactly when and how to use this maneuver. The physics were unforgiving. A split S maneuver begins with a roll to inverted flight, followed by a pull-through into a dive. The aircraft loses altitude rapidly while gaining airspeed. For a P-38 starting from 25,000 feet, a properly executed split S would descend to perhaps 15,000 feet while accelerating to 350 miles per hour. This kept the aircraft within its safe operating envelope. But if executed from lower altitude, or if the pilot pulled too hard on the controls during the maneuver, the Lightning could easily exceed the critical speed where compressibility effects began. Major Richard Bong, who would become America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories, all in P-38 seconds, had developed a similar tactical approach through his own combat experience. Bong flew with the 49th Fighter Group, operating from the same New Guinea bases as Maguire. The 2 pilots never flew together, but they developed nearly identical tactical philosophies through parallel evolution. Altitude was everything. Speed was survival. The split S maneuver was the primary offensive weapon in the P-38 pilot's arsenal. Bong's personal aircraft, a P-38J named Marge after his fiancée, showed the modifications that experienced Lightning pilots made to optimize their aircraft for Pacific combat. The gun sight had been adjusted for maximum accuracy at ranges between 300 and 500 yards. The throttle friction locks had been tightened to prevent inadvertent power changes during violent maneuvering. The rudder trim tabs had been preset for cruise flight, reducing pilot workload during long overwater missions. Most importantly, Bong had perfected the technique of using asymmetric thrust from the twin engines to tighten his turning radius in specific situations. The P-38's counter-rotating propellers, left engine turning counterclockwise and right engine turning clockwise when viewed from the cockpit, created unique handling characteristics that skilled pilots could exploit. During low-speed maneuvering, differential power application could generate a controlled yaw that helped the aircraft rotate faster than aileron input alone could achieve. But this technique required precise coordination and exceptional situational awareness. Any mistake could induce a departure from controlled flight that would be fatal at low altitude. What made these tactics work in the Pacific but fail in Europe came down to the fundamental differences in combat conditions. European theater operations occurred primarily above 20,000 feet, where American heavy bombers flew their daylight raids against German industrial targets. P-38 seconds escorting these bombers had to maintain formation discipline, staying close to their charges even when German fighters attacked. This defensive posture negated the Lightning's primary advantage. Forced to fight at the enemy's chosen altitude and speed, early model P-38 seconds in Europe suffered disproportionate losses. The compressibility problem became acute in European combat because German pilots understood the P-38's weakness and exploited it methodically. Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 pilots would initiate combat from positions of altitude advantage, forcing Lightning pilots to dive to defend their bomber formations. Once the P-38 seconds were committed to the dive, the German pilots would execute their own split-S maneuvers and continue into steep dives, knowing the Lightnings couldn't safely follow beyond 350 miles per hour. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Jenkins, commanding officer of the 55th Fighter Group flying P-38 seconds out of England, documented this tactical problem in mission reports throughout late 1943 and early 1944. His pilots were experiencing a frustrating pattern. They would establish altitude advantage, dive on German formations, achieve favorable firing positions, and then watch helplessly as enemy fighters escaped by diving beyond the P-38's safe speed envelope. The Lightnings would begin to buffet violently as shock waves formed over the wings. The control column would start to buck in the pilot's hands. The nose would tuck down uncontrollably, steepening the dive beyond the pilot's ability to recover. Several P-38 pilots died attempting to follow German fighters through these dives. The phenomenon was inexplicable at first. The aircraft would enter a dive under control, accelerate past 350 miles per hour, and suddenly transform into something that actively tried to destroy its pilot. The tail surfaces would shake violently. The elevator would lose effectiveness. The nose would continue dropping despite full back pressure on the control column. Some pilots reported the control column being ripped from their hands by the forces involved. Others described the aluminum skin on the wings rippling like water as the airframe approached its structural limits. The problem was compressibility, though engineers didn't fully understand it in 1943. As the P-38 approached speeds near Mach 0.65, roughly 400 miles per hour at high altitude, the airflow over certain parts of the wing would reach transonic velocity. Shock waves would form where this supersonic flow transitioned back to subsonic speed. These shock waves disrupted the smooth airflow over the tail surfaces, causing the violent buffeting. More critically, they shifted the center of pressure on the wing from its normal position, at roughly 25% of the chord, to approximately 50% of the chord. This shift created a powerful nose-down pitching moment that overwhelmed the elevator's authority. The solution would eventually come in the form of dive recovery flaps, small surfaces mounted under each wing outboard of the engines. When deployed during a high-speed dive, these flaps didn't slow the aircraft like conventional dive brakes. Instead, they changed the pressure distribution over the wing in a way that delayed the center of pressure shift. This gave the pilot back sufficient elevator authority to control the dive and begin recovery. But the dive flaps didn't reach operational units until June of 1944, and even then, only the final production batch of P-38J25 models had them installed from the factory. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Theater, P-38 pilots had discovered they could avoid the compressibility problem entirely by using proper tactics. The split-S maneuver, when initiated from appropriate altitude with controlled entry technique, kept the Lightning within its safe speed envelope. Pilots learned to recognize the early warning signs. A slight buffet at 320 miles per hour indicated they were approaching the critical speed. Time to ease back on the power and begin leveling out. The key was never allowing the dive to steepen beyond the point where recovery became difficult. Maguire and Bong both became expert at this tactical discipline. Their combat reports showed consistent patterns. Attacks initiated from above 20,000 feet, dives executed with controlled acceleration, firing passes completed before airspeed exceeded 350 miles per hour, immediate zoom climbs back to altitude using energy management rather than prolonged turning engagements. This approach maximized the P-38's strengths while avoiding its weaknesses entirely. The Japanese pilots they faced had no equivalent tactical response. The Zero possessed superior maneuverability at low speed and low altitude, but it couldn't climb with a Lightning in full power. It couldn't dive away from a P-38 that maintained proper speed management. Most critically, Its armament, typically two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns spread across the wings, couldn't match the concentrated firepower of the Lightning's nose-mounted weapons at extended range. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tactical doctrine that emerged from Pacific combat experience represented a complete inversion of traditional fighter pilot thinking. Since the First World War, fighter tactics had emphasized the turning dogfight. Pilots trained to outmaneuver their opponents, using superior turning radius to achieve firing positions. The great aces of World War I, men like Eddie Rickenbacker and Manfred von Richthofen, had built their reputations on turning ability. But the P-38 pilots in the Pacific were discovering that turning fights were obsolete, at least for heavy twin-engine fighters facing nimble single-engine opponents. The new paradigm was energy management. Altitude converted to speed during the dive. Speed converted back to altitude during the zoom climb. The split S maneuver became the fundamental building block of this tactical approach. Roll inverted, pull through, accelerate in the dive, fire during the high-speed pass, zoom back to altitude, assess the tactical situation, and repeat. Each cycle took less than a minute. Each cycle kept the P-38 inches, its optimal performance envelope, while forcing Japanese fighters to react from positions of disadvantage. By December of 1943, Major Thomas Maguire had accumulated 16 confirmed victories using these tactics. His squadron, the 431st Fighter Squadron of the 475th Fighter Group, had achieved the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American fighter unit in the Pacific. The statistics were remarkable. Over a 6-month period, the squadron claimed 83 Japanese aircraft destroyed against only 7 P-38 seconds lost to enemy action. The tactical approach worked because it matched aircraft capabilities to mission requirements with mathematical precision. Major Richard Bong's score climbed even more dramatically. By April of 1944, he had surpassed Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 victories. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, sent Bong home for a publicity tour, concerned that the young pilot's luck would eventually run out if he continued flying combat missions. But Bong returned to the Pacific Theater within weeks, unable to stay away from combat flying. By December of 1944, his score had reached 40 victories, making him America's highest-scoring ace. The competition between Bong and Maguire became front-page news in American newspapers. Sports writers covered their kill tallies like baseball statistics. The two pilots never flew together, but their parallel careers represented the culmination of P-38 tactical development in the Pacific. Both used identical techniques. Both understood that the split S maneuver was the key to survival and success. Both recognized that altitude advantage determined the outcome of every engagement before the first shot was fired. But even as these pilots perfected their tactics in the Pacific, the situation in Europe remained problematic. The compressibility issue continued to plague 8th Air Force P-38 squadrons throughout late 1943 and early 1944. Pilots complained bitterly about the aircraft's diving characteristics. Some refused to fly the Lightning, requesting transfers to units equipped with P-51 Mustangs or P-47 Thunderbolts. The aircraft that dominated in the Pacific had become a liability in European skies. Lockheed engineers understood the technical problem by early 1944. Wind tunnel testing at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics had identified the shock wave formation and center of pressure shift that caused the nose-down pitching moment. The solution, the dive recovery flaps, had been designed, tested, and approved for production implementation. But the modification required changes to the wing structure and the installation of electrical actuation systems. It couldn't be retrofitted in the field without specialized equipment and trained technicians. In March of 1944, Lockheed assembled 200 modification kits containing the dive recovery flaps and all necessary installation hardware. The kits were loaded aboard a Douglas C-54 Skymaster transport for shipment to England, where they would be installed on P-38 J-10 and J-20 models already in theatre. The modification would have given European-based Lightnings the same dive performance that later production aircraft would have from the factory. It would have allowed American pilots to follow German fighters through the split-S escape maneuver that had become standard Luftwaffe doctrine. The C-54 never reached England. On March 14, 1944, an RAF Spitfire pilot intercepted the transport over the English Channel. In the confusion of wartime identification procedures, the British pilot mistook the American C-54 for a German Focke-Wulf 2-100 Condor, a long-range maritime patrol aircraft that the RAF was actively hunting. The Spitfire opened fire, destroying the transport and killing everyone aboard. The 200 dive flap modification kits were lost, along with any chance of retrofitting earlier P-38 models in the European theatre. The loss of the modification kits came during a 4-month tour by Lockheed test pilot Tony Levere, who was visiting P-38 bases throughout Europe to demonstrate proper flying techniques and boost pilot morale. Levere flew a specially modified P-38 J-25, named Snafuperman, that had the dive recovery flaps installed at Lockheed's modification centre near Belfast. His demonstration flights showed skeptical 8th Air Force pilots that the Lightning could indeed dive with German fighters when properly equipped. But with the modification kits destroyed, only new production aircraft coming off the Burbank assembly line would have the dive flaps. The final 210 P-38J models, designated P-38J25LO, began reaching European units in June of 1944. These aircraft had the dive recovery flaps installed on the production line, along with improved intercooler ducting and relocated oil coolers that solved the engine reliability problems that had plagued earlier European-based Lightnings. The tactical situation transformed almost immediately. 8th Air Force P-38 squadrons reported that German fighters could no longer escape by diving. The split-S maneuver, which had been the Luftwaffe's guaranteed escape tactic, suddenly became dangerous for German pilots to attempt. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Jenkins, flying one of the new P-38 J-25 models, filed a combat report in July of 1944 that captured the change in tactical dynamics. His squadron had intercepted a formation of Messerschmitt 109s at 28,000 feet over central Germany. The German pilots, following standard doctrine, executed split-S maneuvers and dove toward lower altitude. Jenkins and his wingman followed, activating their dive recovery flaps as their airspeed exceeded 350 miles per hour. The flaps deployed electrically, small surfaces extending from the underside of each wing just outboard of the engine nacelles. They created additional lift on the forward part of the wing, counteracting the center of pressure shift that occurred at transonic speeds. Jenkins felt the change immediately. The buffeting that normally began at 360 miles per hour was reduced significantly. The control column, which would have been fighting against impossible forces, remained responsive. He maintained his dive through 420 miles per hour, closing on the German fighters who had expected to escape unopposed. At 500 yards range, Jenkins opened fire. His 450 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon sent a concentrated stream of fire into the lead Messerschmitt. The German aircraft absorbed hits along the fuselage and right wing, trailing smoke and debris as it continued its dive. Jenkins pulled back on the control column, and the P-38 responded normally, beginning its recovery from the dive without the violent nose-down pitching that had characterized earlier models. He zoomed back to altitude, reformed his flight, and prepared for another attack. The transformation was complete. The P-38, with its dive recovery flaps, could now execute the same split-S tactics in Europe that had proven so successful in the Pacific. German pilots discovered that their guaranteed escape maneuver no longer worked. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from summer 1944 noted the change in P-38 diving characteristics and recommended that pilots avoid dive engagements with the American twin-engine fighters. But by then, the tactical initiative had shifted decisively to the Allies. German fighter strength was declining rapidly under the weight of combined bomber offensive and the destruction of the Third Reich's fuel production infrastructure. In the Pacific theatre, where P-38 pilots had been using proper split-S tactics all along, the arrival of dive flap-equipped aircraft made less dramatic difference. The tactical doctrine had already been perfected. The dive flaps simply provided additional safety margin for pilots who made mistakes in energy management. McGuire and Bong both transitioned to P-38 liters models, the final production variant with dive flaps installed as standard equipment, but their tactical approach remained unchanged. Altitude advantage, controlled diving attacks, concentrated firepower, and zoom climbs back to safety. The race between McGuire and Bong intensified through the second half of 1944. Bong returned from his stateside publicity tour in September and immediately resumed combat operations. By early December, his score stood at 40 victories, surpassing every American ace in history. General Kenney, recognizing that Bong had become more valuable as a symbol than as a combat pilot, ordered him home permanently. The young ace from Wisconsin had survived 3 years of Pacific combat flying, accumulating more kills than any American pilot would achieve in any war. McGuire, meanwhile, continued flying combat missions through December of 1944. On Christmas Day, he destroyed 3 Japanese fighters in a single engagement. The next day, he shot down 4 more, bringing his total to 38 victories, just 2 behind Bong's record. American newspapers reported the kill tallies like sports scores. McGuire was within striking distance of becoming America's highest-scoring ace, needing just 3 more victories to surpass Bong's record. On January 7, 1945, McGuire led a flight of 4 P-38 seconds on a fighter sweep over Negros Island in the central Philippines. Intelligence had reported Japanese fighters staging through Fabrica airfield, and McGuire's mission was to intercept them before they could attack American positions. The flight climbed to 20,000 feet and established a combat air patrol pattern over the Japanese airfield. In mid-morning, McGuire's wingman spotted a lone Japanese Ki-43 Oscar fighter at low altitude. The enemy aircraft was flying slowly, apparently unaware of the 4 P-38 seconds positioned above. Standard tactical doctrine would have called for a high-side attack, diving on the lone fighter with altitude and speed advantage. But the Oscar was at very low altitude, less than 1,000 feet, and attacking it would require descending into the enemy's optimal fighting envelope. McGuire made a decision that contradicted everything he had taught younger pilots. He rolled his P-38 into a split-S maneuver from 20,000 feet, diving toward the lone Oscar. His wingmen followed, maintaining formation as they descended. The dive carried them down through 15,000 feet, then 10,000, then 5,000. By the time they reached Oscar's altitude, they had lost all their altitude advantage and were flying at low speed in a circular turning flight. The Japanese pilot, Warrant Officer Akira Sugimoto, was not the easy target McGuire had assumed. Sugimoto had over 3,000 hours in the Oscar fighter and was a renowned instructor pilot. He immediately recognized the tactical situation and began defensive maneuvering. The Oscar's superior low-speed handling characteristics gave Sugimoto an advantage that no amount of P-38 firepower could overcome at this altitude and airspeed. Within seconds, Sugimoto had maneuvered onto the tail of McGuire's wingman, Captain Edwin Weaver. McGuire attempted to reverse his turn to threaten the Oscar and draw it off Weaver, but the P-38 at low altitude and low speed couldn't match the Japanese fighter's turning radius. McGuire pulled harder on the control column, trying to tighten his turn. The Lightning's airspeed dropped below 150 miles per hour, approaching the edge of the stall regime. The P-38 had forgiving stall characteristics when flown clean, without external stores. But McGuire's aircraft was carrying 2 310-gallon drop tanks under the wings, installed for the long-range mission profile. With the external tanks attached, the stall became violent and unrecoverable at low altitude. McGuire's Lightning snapped into a spin, the nose dropping suddenly as the wing exceeded its critical angle of attack. At less than 1,000 feet altitude, there was no possibility of recovery. The P-38 struck the jungle canopy seconds later, the impact killing McGuire instantly. His wingmen watched helplessly as America's second highest-scoring ace died attempting a maneuver that violated every tactical principle he had perfected over 2 years of combat flying. The split-S maneuver, which had been his primary weapon when executed from positions of altitude advantage, had become his death sentence when used inappropriately at low altitude. The irony was profound. WWII had survived hundreds of combat missions by understanding exactly when and how to use the split-S maneuver. He had trained younger pilots to maintain altitude discipline, to never engage in low-altitude turning fights with more maneuverable opponents, to always preserve energy advantage as the foundation of tactical success. But in the pressure of combat, chasing his final victories to surpass Bong's record, he had abandoned his own doctrine and died as a result. The tactical lesson was clear. The split-S maneuver was not a universal solution. It was a specific tool that worked only when employed from appropriate altitude with proper energy management. Executed correctly from 20,000 feet against targets at lower altitude, it transformed the P-38 into a devastating weapon. Executed incorrectly at low altitude against a more maneuverable opponent, it was suicide. The difference between the two scenarios came down to discipline and judgment, qualities that even the best pilots could lose in the heat of combat. Richard Bong never learned of WWII's death. By January of 1945, Bong had been assigned to Lockheed's test facility in Burbank, California, where he was evaluating the new P-80 Shooting Star jet fighter. The war in the Pacific was approaching its conclusion. Germany would surrender in May. Japan's remaining air force was being systematically destroyed by American bombing campaigns. The age of propeller fighters was ending, replaced by jets that could fly faster than the speed of sound. On August 6, 1945, Bong was conducting a test flight in a P-80 when the primary fuel pump failed. The jet engine, unlike the forgiving Allison piston engines he had flown in combat, quit immediately without power. Bong attempted a dead-stick landing at Burbank, but the glide ratio wasn't sufficient. At 500 feet above the ground, realizing he would come up short of the runway, he pulled the ejection handles on the experimental seat. The ejection system fired, but the altitude was insufficient for the parachute to deploy fully. Bong struck the ground moments before his P-80 crashed into a residential street. America's highest-scoring ace died, testing the technology that would make his combat skills obsolete. The same day, 8,000 miles away, the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. The symbolic weight was overwhelming. The pilot who had perfected the tactical use of the split-S maneuver in a piston-engine fighter died in a jet aircraft, on the same day that nuclear weapons made conventional aerial combat seem almost quaint. The P-38 Lightning's combat record showed the importance of matching tactics to aircraft capabilities. In the Pacific theater, where pilots understood and exploited the Lightning's strengths while avoiding its weaknesses, the aircraft achieved remarkable success. Over 1,800 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. More than 100 pilots became aces. The top two American fighter pilots of the war, Bong and WWII, both flying Lightnings exclusively. In the European theater, where early tactical doctrine forced the P-38 into roles that highlighted its weaknesses, the results were far less impressive. High loss rates, pilot complaints about aircraft handling, German pilots learning to exploit the compressibility problem. Only when the dive recovery flaps arrived in summer 1944 did the European P-38 squadrons achieve results comparable to Pacific operations, and by then, the P-51 Mustang was available in sufficient numbers that most Lightning units converted to the single-engine fighter. The split-S maneuver, which had been the foundation of Pacific P-38 tactics, became a case study in the importance of energy management in fighter combat. The maneuver worked brilliantly when executed from altitude advantage with controlled technique. It failed catastrophically when attempted at low altitude with inadequate energy reserves. The difference between the two scenarios was entirely under the pilot's control, a matter of discipline rather than aircraft capability. Post-war analysis of P-38 combat operations revealed patterns that would influence fighter tactics for decades. The importance of altitude advantage, the primacy of energy management over sustained turning, the value of concentrated forward-firing armament, the tactical flexibility provided by twin-engine reliability on long over-water missions. All these lessons carried forward into the jet age, informing the design of aircraft like the F-4 Phantom, which shared the P-38's twin-engine configuration and emphasis on speed over maneuverability. The Lightning's legacy extended beyond tactical doctrine to influence aircraft design philosophy. The twin-boom configuration, which had seemed radical in 1937 when Lockheed first proposed it, proved sound in combat operations. The counter-rotating propellers eliminated torque problems that plagued single-engine fighters. The tricycle landing gear improved ground handling and reduced landing accidents. The nose-mounted armament solved the convergence problems that affected wing gun installations. All these features became standard in post-war fighter design. But the compressibility problem, which had nearly destroyed the P-38's reputation in European operations, pointed toward a fundamental limitation of piston-engine fighters. As aircraft speeds approached the speed of sound, aerodynamic phenomena occurred that existing design methods couldn't predict. The shockwave formation that caused the P-38's diving problems was a warning of things to come. Future fighters would need entirely different design approaches to operate safely at transonic and supersonic speeds. The dive recovery flaps that solved the P-38's compressibility problem represented an interim solution. They delayed the onset of transonic effects, but they couldn't eliminate them. The Lightning's critical Mach number remained around 0.68, regardless of the dive flaps. This meant that at altitudes above 20,000 feet, the aircraft was always operating near the edge of its aerodynamic envelope. Any dive that exceeded 350 miles per hour indicated airspeed risked entering the compressibility regime. Test pilots who evaluated captured German fighters after the war discovered that the Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 had similar compressibility problems. The German aircraft could operate at slightly higher Mach numbers, around 0.75, before encountering severe control difficulties. This small advantage had been enough to give German pilots their escape tactic. By diving beyond the P-38's safe speed envelope, they could break contact and evade, knowing American pilots couldn't safely follow. The arrival of dive flap-equipped P-38 seconds in summer 1944 closed this tactical gap. German pilots who attempted the split-S escape maneuver discovered that the new Lightnings could follow them through the dive. The brief period from June through December 1944 saw the P-38 finally achieve its design potential in European combat. But by then, the strategic air war had shifted to a different phase. Germany's fighter defences were collapsing under the weight of sustained Allied bombing campaigns. Fuel shortages grounded experienced pilots. The Luftwaffe's remaining strength was concentrated in jet fighters like the Me-262, which could outrun even the improved P-38 seconds. In the Pacific theatre, where the split-S maneuver had always worked when properly executed, the final months of the war saw P-38 units transitioning to other aircraft. The P-51 Mustang offered similar range, with better high-altitude performance and lower maintenance requirements. The P-38's twin engines, which had provided crucial safety margins on long over-water missions, became less important as American forces established airfields on captured islands throughout the Pacific. By August of 1945, only a handful of P-38 squadrons remained in combat operations. The final irony came in the form of institutional memory. The tactical lessons learned by Maguire, Bong, and hundreds of other P-38 pilots in the Pacific were never systematically documented in training manuals or doctrine publications. The knowledge existed in the minds of combat veterans, transmitted through informal mentorship and squadron tradition. When these pilots left military service after the war, their tactical expertise went with them. Future generations of fighter pilots would have to relearn many of the same lessons about energy management, altitude advantage, and proper execution of diving attacks. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.